Well, welcome to the 34th episode of 10-Minute Record Reviews. This time we're going to talk about Alice Coltrane's wonderful 1971 album released on Impulse, Journey in Satchidananda. As I say, the original came out in 1971. Those original pressings on Impulse sound wonderful, but they cost a pretty penny to get your hands on. I haven't managed to do that. This is a 2019 reissue by Impulse, fair enough. And it sounds pretty good, but I still will be tempted by an early pressing if I could get my hands on it. This is a little bit distorted at the top end, not enough to really bother you unless you're listening for it, but it is, once you've heard it, it is there. Alice Coltrane is pretty much the kind of the high priestess of what's termed spiritual jazz, which is a kind of jazz which emerges largely after the death of John Coltrane in 1967, driven very much by Alice Coltrane, by Pharoah Sanders, by some other folks. Its music was not necessarily swing, but it is beautiful and it's transcendent, it's passionate, and also noteworthy for bringing in lots of non-Western instrumentation. So it's jazz, certainly, but there are lots of tendrils and connections to other kinds of music and other traditions of music. What to say about Alice Coltrane? Well, she's born Alice MacLeod. She was a jazz pianist who grew up and started to perform in Detroit. She did study under Bud Powell, the famous progenitor of bebop piano, and she was active as a professional musician from late 50s into the 1960s, sometimes as a leader of her own group, sometimes as a participant in a quartet or a trio, largely playing in Detroit. She married and had kids in 1960, and which had some effect on limiting her ability to tour. She meets, first marriage ends early. She meets John Coltrane in and around 62 or 63. They only have about 4.5 years together, but it's a remarkable flurry. They meet at that point, they get married in 65, they release several albums, they have 3 children, and then in 1967 he passes away. So it's that there's an enormous amount of life and productivity and living sort of compressed into a very short period of time for those two people. And when he died, it's obviously a very traumatic thing for her, and she apparently went into a real shell for a while. She undergoes a spiritual transformation as part of this, fanned in part by meeting the Swami Satchidananda, after whom the album is named. At the time of John Coltrane's death, he of course was a highly spiritual individual and had been since his recovery from heroin addiction. They were moving towards a more universalist, a kind of a non-Western spirituality, and exploring that frenetically, really, in John's case, musically. After he dies, she goes through this further sort of religious transformation or spiritual transformation. She learns how to play the harp and began to write music which had many sort of non-Western influences, including a lot of music for the tambur, which is this sort of droning Indian stringed instrument, which provides a lot of the very typical sort of sonic landscape for, well, certainly for this album and for other work that Alice was to do. Although she'd very much been in her husband's shadow when she was, when John Coltrane was alive, she emerges very definitely as a star in her own right in the late 60s and early 70s, and the music she plays is, although it has linkages, very clear linkages back to the music that she and John were playing and the music he was writing, it is very distinct. It is clearly an evolution of her own making, and a very distinct statement that she's making in the years after his death. There is real progression, I think, you can hear in every record. If you're going to get any of them, this is a great one to get. The other one, which is almost impossible to find for less than $400 or $500, is Patah the El Daoud, which I think is her total masterwork, but has sadly not yet been reissued by anybody. So if you can only listen to it really on CD. The music. So side one begins with the title track, Journey in Satchidananda, and what you're introduced to is a sound which really is very much the sound of the album. You get these hypnotic riffs. Reliant in part on the tambur being played by a musician called Tulsi, and also by we're also relying on Cecil McBee's wonderful bass playing. And they, in most of these songs, the two of these musicians just play these, as I said, regular sort of hypnotic rhythms, which set a very, very Indian-seeming, spiritual, exploratory, otherworldly, certainly to Western ears, tone, and layered over that, variously are Pharoah Sanders' sax, but in this case, in terms of the title track, it's Alice's harp, which gets the biggest spotlight and really takes you on quite a trip, sort of, musically, emotionally too. I think that first song, followed by Shiva Loka. Here, Pharoah Sanders, who is the now Pharoah Sanders, of course, was part of Coltrane's band, John Coltrane's band, and is famous for, in his own work, in his own spiritual recordings, for very passionate playing, and also for the technique of overblowing, which is basically getting the saxophone to squawk and squeak. Takes some getting used to for untutored ears. Here, he's on this album, he's much more restrained. He's and he kicks things off on this second track. Once again, you've got that great sort of pulsing rhythm from the rhythm section. Then Alice Coltrane comes in with a quite a frenetic solo again on harp. McBee at points is playing his bass with a bow. The journey of this track ends with a wonderful sort of long extended note on bass. And then the final song on side one is Stop Over Bombay. Alice now switches from harp to piano. She spends time doing call and answer with McBee's bass. There's a lot of tension building early in the song, and including sort of strategic use of key changes. Sanders again comes in, wonderful playing. Really quite restrained, which is so interesting if you're used to his other work. This is actually a relatively short song. It's like a snippet of a longer piece. Side 2 begins with Something About John Coltrane, which obviously is a reflection on her late husband, and in interviews, Alice would frequently talk about John being present emotionally, mentally for her as she's composing music, and this is an explicit visitation to that relationship, although there were lots of other implicit ones in her work. It's got a nice sort of walking bass line from McBee, and again the tambour from Tulsi, which is that sort of unifying thread through much of this album. Of the four studio sides, the bass and tambour just provide this unifying piece. Alice plays a piano solo here, which is very John Coltrane-like as a solo, at least initially. That kind of serial repetition of phrases that Coltrane was on saxophone was very fond of. But then she takes it to a place which is very much her and not really his style at all. Pharoah comes in very reverently. I mean, this is a meaningful song for the musicians. That is palpable. Then he goes to a place which is much more restrained, much less restrained than anything else in the record, where he is overblowing and is harkening back to the sort of more exploratory days with John Coltrane. Then finally, the last track is Isis and Osiris, which is, as I mentioned, a live performance recorded at the Village Gate. Here, the instrumentation and the personnel are slightly different. There's a fellow called Vishnu Wood who is guesting on the oud, which is an Arab stringed instrument. It's not dissimilar to, say, a bouzouki or a lute. There's a very kind of wistful contribution from Pharoah Sanders on soprano sax. Rashid Ali, who drums all the way through this and provides percussion, is much more present on this track than he is on the four studio tracks, which we've heard so far. And likewise, I guess in a reversal of roles, Alice's contribution here, which has been quite prominent, obviously, she's been the leader through the studio tracks. Her contribution on this cut from the Village Gate is really quite subtle, and for the most part, it's Pharoah Sanders who's a star in this particular track. What to say about this album overall? It's a superb album. This is not the kind of jazz that most people are first introduced to, and it is a wonderful thing to discover spiritual jazz, and an even more wonderful thing to discover Alice's albums, in particular this one. It's spiritual, it's moving, it's peaceful, it stretches a listener. I think the New Yorker had this great phrase which said that the spiritual jazz that was associated with Alice Coltrane, with Sanders, was music which was in a hurry to get somewhere. at this particular point. That there was a destination exploration, and that with every album they were working out where they were going. Probably also dating back to John Coltrane's later work as well. And yet at the same time, I agree, it's a music which is in a hurry to get somewhere, but it also, there's nothing rushed about this. The music takes its time, and it really is a transcendent experience to listen to this. So I give it 5 stars. Do yourself a favor if you haven't listened to this record, if you haven't become acquainted with Alice Coltrane, please do.